Ana Cristina Pereira will present the task 3 that is related to migrant activism.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for being here. I'm going to read my presentation because unfortunately I don't have the skills of Carla Cerqueira, and if I speak without reading, I will speak half an hour and I will not say what I have to say. It's mine. Thank you. So I'm going to read first to give you a little bit of context of our task, and then I will present the task itself. Although Portugal as an imagined community has been constructed over centuries as white European and Christian country, Roma people live in Portugal since the 16th century, and a considerable part of the country's population has deep roots in Angola, Brazil, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, São Tomé e Príncipe, and less expressively in other African countries, among our territories around the world. Portugal's contemporary racial composition is the product of enslavement and slave trade routes and modern colonization, which was built on networks encompassing Portuguese colonies and the metropole. The independence of former Portuguese colonies in Africa brought 500,000 citizens of different ethnic origins to Portugal, and more recently, migration from Portuguese-speaking countries increased. A consequence of and in response to racism towards Black and Roma communities in Portugal, the Portuguese counterpublic stems from the mutual influence of counter-knowledge and resistance movements, primarily coming from Brazil, the United States, and several African countries. Let me see if this, okay. After the 1974 revolution that overthrew Salazar's dictatorship, Portugal readopted its adhesion to European Union as a national project, intended to project itself onto a democratic, developed, and cultural Europe, perceived as exclusively white and Christian. Nevertheless, Portugal has not overcome its structural backwardness in relation to countries of the rich Europe, as illustrated by the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent austerity measures against the pigs. Caught between imperial nostalgia and its desire to belong to a superior and whiter Europe, Portugal has never carried out an internal reflection on the legacies of colonialism and decolonization in today's society. This lack of self-reflection has impacted the process of invisibilizing Black and Roma presence in Portugal and its contribution to the construction of the Portuguese identity and citizenship. It has also fortified a cancelled racism that denies the existence of structural racism in the country and avoids addressing race as a social fact. However, structural racism is sustained and aggravated by a grammar of the nation pivoted on an imagination of the center, as Santos says, in which Portugal formulates its societal problems in the same way as those of the societies perceived to be more developed and civilized, reproducing the agendas and frames of the center as their own. Despite the reproduction of the European discourses regarding immigrants and refugees, immigrants from countries not formally colonized by Portugal arrive at a considerably lower rate in Portugal that is not perceived as belonging to the Europe of the opportunities. In Portugal, the omnipresent myth of Lusotropicalism, the idea that Portuguese have a particular vocation for mixing with other peoples, structural to the Estado Novo ideology, Estado Novo that existed between 1933 and 74, coexists with the denial of the nation's multicultural composition. Furthermore, Portuguese exceptionalism, in which Portugal positions itself as the world's navel, referring to a peaceful communication agent between all peoples, does not avoid the nation's fear of invasion. Moreover, the belief that the Portuguese are tolerant and accepting does not delude the historical and ongoing othering of some communities, such as Roma community and Black community, which are not perceived as Portuguese by white society. These contradictions have been naturalized in everyday life. Therefore, we can understand the grammar of the Portuguese nation as constituted through cognitive dissonance. We talk about this morning, right? Causing a permanent, latent, never resolved social conflict. Rooted in anti-Black racism, the reproduction of European discourses of invasion by migrants and refugees on the hegemonic we sustains and furthers violent institutional racism against Black and Roma people. As an example, I can give the openly anti-Roma discourse by a political party, Chega, a police violence, a case of police violence in Esquadra de Alfragide towards a group of Black young men in 2015. Police violence against a Black woman named Claudia Simões in 2020. The death of a young Black man named Danny Joy in prison in 2021. And also a non-less aggressive everyday racism. Aggressions towards a Black girl named Nicole Quinaias in the bus in 2018, the murder of a Black student, Giovanni Rodrigues, in 2019, and the murder of a Black actor, Bruno Candé, in 2020. In response, post-colonial counter-public resistance offers options for debordering the public sphere, challenging collective memory, contesting ongoing racialization processes, and building more inclusive models of citizenship. Following Nancy Fraser, we understand counter-public spheres as spaces where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs. Concerning Black resistance, the struggle for recognition has long history stretching from the 16th century Black confraternities to late 20th century immigration associations, including various formations and manifestations of struggle over time. There are two central moments. I'm sorry, it would be easier, but no, it's said. There are two central moments of the Portuguese Black counter-public reorganization in the last decades. The first began at the end of the empire and the 48-year-long Salazarian dictatorship, which witnessed the construction of African migrants associations, and ended by the 90s when African descendants launched the organization and building of counter-narratives, that is post-colonial and anti-racist narratives through academia and arts. The second moment corresponds to the first 2 decades of the 21st century, when activists and artists began using digital media, especially social media, to amplify their voices. Features of this wave of activisms are, on the one hand, the growth of an informed and politicized middle class of Portuguese Black people, and on the other hand, the formation of a new, highly politicized component of the Black movement, namely Afro-Brazilian youth, often joining Portugal via the Portuguese Academia. Besides the differential degree of segregation and invisibilization, which varies by intersection of class, gender, and geographical location, this multi-layered social background is where practice of counter-representation of those who are subalternized occur. Questioning the effects of the triad composed by colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy, Afro-descendants and Roma people appear on the cultural, artistical, and political scene. Women often take the leadership in these movements to testify for a new Afro-Portuguese generation of militants and activists who refuse the regime of intersectional violence to which their ancestors were subjected. So we have this background, and we aim to fill a gap in the Portuguese studies about these counter narratives, these Black and Roma subjects as producers of knowledge and of discourse, and not as objects of study. Okay, so our objects are this: understanding the process of debordering played by civil society activists who are migrants, or members of racialized groups in Portugal. The first movement will be to mapping different forms of activism and cultural deboarding projects involving people with migration background and racialized groups in Portugal. I must say that this first objective is almost, it is quite advanced because we have already a good map. Let's say it's not 100% complete, but it's going on that to that direction. And B, identifying individual, that this is what we are doing now, identifying individual characteristics of each project, the relationship amongst them, and the tactics they implement to foster more inclusive models of citizenship. We can say we are going to understand each project deeper. Then we are going to try to understand the power relations between these projects and the global agendas, the capacity they have to influence the political agenda in Portugal, and on the contrary, if they are permeáveis to that. This doesn't go now. Finally, we want to analyze identity narratives that the public figures, whatever that means, of these movements share regarding their experiences and the acts of debordering they perform based on their life stories. The questions are: how are the counter-public spheres constituted by migrants and members of racialized groups reorganized in Portugal, according to what I've said about these 2 last decades. What projects, collectives, associations, and cooperatives exist and where? How are the existing projects characterized? What are their agendas and how are they articulated or not with each other? What is the level of independence of these activist projects and how can they influence local and global political agendas? And what kind of personal or individual narratives feed these counter-public spheres? What we are going to analyze Portugal political activist projects by migrants and racialized groups, materials produced by these activists, including political events, but mostly text, also media objects, brochures. I don't know now the names in English. I wrote it, but I will not read it because I'm late. But all the kinds of materials that the associations produce to communicate. And also the discourses produced by these. How we will do it? Our task is divided in 2 axes. In the first axe, we will consult newspapers, here they are, internet sites and other media about existing associations and events, consulting materials produced by different collectives on their activities, brochures, films, manifestos. And we will contact activist personalities and groups who will offer us information about least known groups and manifestations. In the second act, we will gather life stories using semi-structured interviews with the main actors of these movements. In both axes, provided that the participants give their consent, we will record images and audio. The material we will collect will be submitted to multimodal analysis through intersectional and decolonial lenses. And most importantly, it will be used in one of our milestones that will be a short film on migrant activism produced together with Task 4. And that's all. Thank you very much.